Welcome, everybody, to the Winning Digital Customers podcast. I have another awesome guest, a friend who I've known for many, many years, who now works in the office of the CIO for Google, though he has been through a number of very, very interesting chapters in his career. So I want to really pick his brain today, including on he had spent time as an entrepreneur in residence at Citibank, experiencing what it's like to drive digital transformation in a large enterprise. He spent time running his own startups, and now at Google, he is offered to do for us on this podcast something that Google has him doing with only the top CXO of leading brands, which is to give briefings on what is the latest insights that Google has about how to drive most effective work from home, kind of future of work stuff in this area of COVID. So Google's got him, his job right now, and we'll ask him to perhaps give us a better explanation of it, but his job right now is going around and working with Google's customers to help support them and provide Google's best thinking around that. And he's going to give as much as he can to us today in the time that we have on the podcast. So with that, Tejpaul Bhatia, a longtime friend and somebody I've often admired, and I'm so pleased that you're on the podcast today. Let me turn it over to you, Tej, and ask you to introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your career journey, because it's just such a fascinating story.
Sure. Howard, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to reconnect. I can't wait till we can do it in real life.
Yeah.
In person. This is real life. Just have to remind myself every now and then. But yeah, I can give you my career journey, which starts back actually when you and I first met. I got my career started in media, entertainment, technology. I was at ESPN. And this is probably the first time I had heard the term digital transformation. And it had a very different meaning back then. If you remember, that was, for some companies, literally meant putting a website up, meant digital transformation. Mm-hmm. I think you and I connected a little bit more on like the streaming media side of things. ESPN had brought me in to launch a product called ESPN3. We rebranded as ESPN 360, and then now it's back as ESPN 3 and under the Watch ESPN umbrella. But that's really where I got my first kind of taste of being able to drive transformational change, digital or not. In most of my cases, it's been digital at a big corporate. And in 2007, I left ESPN and started my entrepreneurial journey. I became a startup founder. I was a startup founder for 10 years. 3 different companies, all 3 based here in New York, all 3 investor backed. One was in the photo sharing space, one was in the video chatting space, and the most recent one is in the educational technology space, K through 12 technology. And then in 2017, coincidentally or not so coincidentally, timed when my son was born, I decided I wanted to stop being a startup founder and leverage everything I've learned and go back to big corporate. And my first job after being a startup founder was, as you mentioned it, being an entrepreneur in residence at Citibank, particularly Citi Ventures. So the jump from startup to corporate was major shock therapy.
Culture shock? Did you need a whole new wardrobe?
Interestingly, no. We were the guys who were and the guys and girls who were allowed to wear jeans, except for when we went to the 37th floor. No, we were really brought in as this SWAT team, Tiger team, innovation team at Citibank. So I joked that it was a culture shock in terms of going from startup to a 200-year-old, 200,000 person company, and the original heritage company, kind of the old school New York finance company, and it was a shock. However, I was part of Citi Ventures, which is their corporate venture arm. It's this bubble of innovation and a different way of thinking, but mostly for investing externally on Citibank's behalf. What they brought us entrepreneurs in residence in was to create a program inside Citibank where Citi employees, and when I say employees, I mean literally could be managing director. There were several founders in our program that were very senior at the company, all the way down to a teller at a branch. People working on the front line with customers, either consumer or institutional, who were seeing the problems out in the field, and they brought 12 of us EIRs across Silicon Valley, New York, London, Singapore to work with these employees and educate them on how to think more like startup founders.
Cool.
And at the same time, work with management and the C-suite at Citibank to enable that kind of agility.
So you were there to create as much culture shock as you were actually experiencing.
Yeah, literally. I mean, I remember, I won't say who, but my boss said, your job is to shake shit up.
Mm-hmm.
And we did, and we got in trouble. But luckily we were protected. And I'll go into a couple of tips that worked, but we were protected from CEO down. It was definitely a very well thought out program. And for me, it was amazing on a few fronts. One is, as I mentioned, my background was in media. I had zero finance background. And half of the EIRs either worked in banking or had fintech startups. Half of us didn't. What we all had was multiple startups under our belt. So coming in as a startup person, asking dumb questions worked really well. And the learning curve was steep for me when it came to finance, but I loved it. From a subject matter standpoint, I never thought I could work in finance. And a lot of this was maybe stereotypes based on New Yorkers who work in finance. And many of those stereotypes are true, by the way. But the subject matter was fascinating. And when you take in digital transformation, the speed of innovation that's happening in the market, it was really interesting to see how this company was going to make that transformation. And I was there for about a year and a half. And then Google called me and brought me in this role called Startup Ecosystem Manager. So I summarized that role, and it was a little over 2 years of my job at Google as being an ambassador for Google out to the startup community, but more importantly, being an advocate for startups inside Google. And then in March timeframe of 2020, the CIO, the Chief Information Officer of Google, who happens to be based in New York, had seen some of the work I'd done in the startup world and said, hey, could you help us with that kind of storytelling from an enterprise IT standpoint out to the world? And similar to how I had these kind of aversions to finance, I had all these aversions to IT as well. I'm not an IT person. I'm a media tech person. I'm an entrepreneur. And the way he framed it, and my current manager framed it, and she actually isn't she's new to the org also. She comes from the marketing side. They said, hey, this is about storytelling. And you know what? Nobody in the world has ever told this story before. Yet every single person in the world can relate. We're all at home. We're all going through this together. And enterprise IT technology is literally the only medium for company culture to spread right now. And even when the offices come back, they're going to be some sort of hybrid setup. It's time to reimagine that future. And you can be the person who's creating that point of view. Yeah. And it really stuck. And, that's how you and I have reconnected many times over the years, but also kind of with the work that you're doing. That's an area that, has plugged in between Citi Ventures and Google from a digital transformation side. When I was at Citi Ventures, it was kind of a choice. And now, as of earlier this year, there is no choice. I think you may have even shared this image with this. There was a meme going around that, what triggered your digital transformation? And, 10 out of 10 companies will say it was COVID.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's an amazing journey. And I want to get back to the Google side. But before we do that, I want to go back a little to the Citi side. And I'd love to learn from you, what were the kind of most important learnings you had? If you are speaking to so many of our listeners are at large enterprises and they're trying to drive digital transformation, they may not be an entrepreneur resident specifically, but they're facing the challenge of try to, shake shit up at large companies, and they're getting in trouble, just like you did. What did you learn? What are the best tactics? Could be learned, do this, or, and maybe it's things that Citi was doing right in terms of how they set the program up, or things you learned in terms of how you were able to do things, or even the don't do's, things that you discovered, probably better not do that. That doesn't seem to work. Any of that, would love your tips and tricks.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I can give you a couple of perspectives. I can give you how do you set this program up for success? So let's say you're that head of innovation or transformation. You're not in the C-suite. You're also not entry level, but you've got to position this thing or whatever you're trying to push forward in a way that's going to get the best support possible. That's not something I would have been aware of how to do before my role at Citi. And I can give you the perspective of how does a large corporation operate more like a startup. What I found in my last 3 to 4 years being back in corporate, much of my work as an EIR at Citi, as a startup ecosystem manager at Google, and now in the office of the CIO, is educating corporate executives on how startup founders think. And it's a totally different mentality that may or may not work in big corporates, but it's very much based on iteration and experimentation, which I think fundamentally corporations can build into these programs. Now, we know when it comes to, getting your program funded, there's a lot of work that goes in, as does with startups, but it's very different. You got to get buy-in, you got to get consensus, stakeholders, depending on the culture of your company and your management chain. But there are ways to kind of instill that founder mindset into your company and your programs. So from the corporate standpoint, there's a couple of things that I think Citi did that really set the program up nicely. One is they had top-down, bottom-up, and kind of lateral support across the country. Across the company and across the globe. Now, the top-down is literally CEO, heads of the unit. And as I mentioned, this program was part of Citi Ventures and was directly the responsibility of our Chief Innovation Officer. And she did a phenomenal job of having that top-down support. Now, that top-down support alone will not work, right? The C-suite at Citibank is not, identifying better ways to speed up the line at the branch. Not that they're not capable of it, but the decisions they're making are not, at that level, nor are they seeing it every day.
Right.
So this brings me to the second point where you need that bottoms-up approach. So you need the people in the front line to want to be part of this program, to share those ideas. And that's a lot of internal marketing, positioning, creating a nice vision, and then literally distributing that message across the globe. A 200,000 plus company. It's not easy to get that word out. So you really need, like I said, a top down, bottoms up. Now, where that lateral support also comes in is buy-in. So I'm going to use Citibank and the finance industry specifically. You need buy-in from the business unit heads. And I'll explain how Citi had done that. And that comes in, hey, this is actually a problem we want to solve, a customer target we want to go after, something we want to fund. And that's really important. So getting their buy-in and as stakeholders early in the process of the ideation is very important. Mm-hmm. And then second, being part of Citi Ventures under this group, there was a pool of money. We could seed these ideas without permission. And I don't mean don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. There was some element of that, but a little bit of like, look, we're going to try 100 things. Most will not work, but that's okay. Right? And the few that start to bubble up or show some evidence will get those business unit heads, stakeholders. And you know what? A lot of the ideas are coming from people within their unit as well. So I think kind of having those three kind of areas of support really set the program up to succeed. And also kind of at the top levels, C-suite and then heads of the units, helping come up with themes, right? And this is something that EIRs did ourselves, but really getting their buy-in into changing social structures as a theme. What does a family look like? Where banking was really built for the 1950s family in the U.S. It's very different now. Things like micropayments, alternative financing, all these other things that are happening. The shift of wealth from boomers to millennials. Largest shift in wealth in history.
Right.
These are things that we could think out strategically.
And these are things you're getting from those lateral business unit leaders. Is that right? They're telling you these are the things that we're thinking about.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of areas where they would be interested in investment and funding if you find a solution.
And there was a method to teasing those out. We hosted multiple day ideation sessions around themes. And these were super fun. You and I actually, this is another time we'd reconnected at your loft space. We would go off site, do a day of design thinking, kind of just forget everything
Mm-hmm.
A
Mm-hmm.
day of, hey, these are the problems. Let's think about, let's hone in on what are the problems. And the third day, let's come out with high-level solutions themes. Some of those became businesses that, would go through our program. But it was a way to really get cross-functional buy-in across the company. And again, you have a bunch of EIRs, some with background in finance, some not, but really who don't have, we don't have chips in the game in the sense that, like, I was a contractor. It was 18 months. I wasn't vying for promotion. I wasn't, there was no politicking going on. And I was bringing in experience and expertise that wasn't readily available inside the company.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's a couple of side effects of it. Sorry, there's one other thing a tip where I think they, on the lateral side, specifically for finance, is there are a lot of regulations in place and, compliance, rightfully so, that is designed to prevent bad actors or bad situations from happening again.
Yeah.
So you have to work with those systems. And sometimes, people might think that those systems are there to stifle innovation. And they're not. They're there to protect the consumer. And there's a way to work with them. And our CIO really did an amazing job with this. Was really a shift in mentality from no to how.
Mm-hmm.
Their job is to say no, and it should be to say no. We all, as consumers of the banking industry, want them to do that. But that doesn't mean you have to bring an idea to them at the moment of yes or no. You can start getting them as stakeholders earlier on and say, hey, look, I'm not looking for a yes or no, but how do I make sure this doesn't become a no 6 months from now?
Yeah.
And those side effects I talk about that came out of it, a couple of businesses made it out. Let's hope it's success for the company. But it was a great employee morale and retention tool. People loved it. I mean, I was there for 18 months. We were called coaches internally. And I haven't been at Citibank working there for 3 months, but I actually do some work with them now through Google. And the last time, this was January, but that I went to the headquarters on Greenwich Street, I'll walk in the lobby and people will still be like, "Yo, coach!" And like, we were rock stars inside the company.
You wear a whip around your neck.
And exactly, that's a good idea. I wish I'd done that. But it was really good, So like from the employee morale standpoint, it was great. And then I think one of the biggest innovations, my manager at the end when my term was coming up, he had said, if we can speed up the path to for products, product development, that's a win, right? If we've solved how to get a product out the door, and this is where digital transformation comes in significantly.
I apologize. My phone rang. Would you mind just going back, and they'll edit this? Just go back to if we can speed up the path.
Yeah. So I'll go back. Okay. So my manager at the end of my term there, he had said, if all we get out of this program is a faster path for products to make it to market, it's a win. And I can almost be certain with that kind of no to how mentality shift that we accomplished that.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it's every corporation is looking at startups from a few points of view. One is an existential point of view. Like, is this the company that's going to make us obsolete? Are we the next Blockbuster Video? And that's real.
Yeah.
Corporations are talking about this all the time. Second is, at the size of certain industries like the banking industry, there's a common saying that fintech startups are the de facto R&D lab for the finance industry.
Mm-hmm.
They just can't innovate at that level, or that speed. So they want to form those relationships out with the startup community. And I think a combination of this awareness and partnerships with external startups and internal innovation, this is where I think digital transformation comes in. And one thing that was very clear throughout my experience at Citibank was there were groups that were exploring cloud infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Right now, banks have a lot of regulation and reason to maintain their data centers, even though I don't think that's actually good for anyone. But by law, they have to do that. And they're slow to figure out how do we have this hybrid cloud, distributed cloud infrastructure. And while it sounds like very much an infrastructure decision, what cloud enables for enterprises is rapid product development, developer happiness, lets you innovate at a pace where you don't have to worry about certain things because you can create sandboxes, test things out, and pull them out very quickly. And we were very tightly coupled with that group at Citibank.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also part of the reason, at Google, I continue to work with them, amongst other things. But I think, I started this conversation about, digital transformation 20 plus years ago meant get a website up. And now it's kind of swung the other way where it's let's modernize our infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
But there is actually something in the middle. Like, how do you get an app up? How do you get a new service up quickly and then pull it back if it's wrong, or iterate and adapt on it? And the way current infrastructure is set up for a lot of these enterprises, it's not possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. I want to ask you one follow-up question on this, and then I definitely want to talk more about the Google side here. You mentioned the idea that you were there to help the folks there get sort of in the mind of the CEO of a startup.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what aspects of the mind of the CEO of a startup really seemed beneficial and valuable and workable in the context of an organization like Citi? And were there some things that you'd say, yeah, this is an aspect of how entrepreneurial, startup CEOs think that frankly doesn't align, isn't useful. It's useful for the CEO of a startup, but not a tactic to think would be useful to think that way as a, say, executive at a large bank.
Yeah, and that's a great question. Actually, is a great segue into Google. One thing, in this last corporate chapter of mine, where I've seen myself become an expert, an educator on, is this mindset of the founder. And for better or for worse, I wasn't a great founder, but I have my 10,000 plus hours, right? Like I was in here the whole time.
Well, right. Sure.
Yeah, probably a little too much in here. So I've been refining this theme or this thesis, and at Google, I really solidified. I call it the essence of a startup. And what is it that fundamentally makes a startup different than a corporate? And the reason to understand this can be two ways. One, at Citibank is very much to think more like a founder.
Mm-hmm.
At Google, it was very much about how do we add value to startups in the ecosystem, particularly around cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a couple of things to note about this. One, a startup, and I'll get to the founder mindset in a second. A startup is neither an enterprise nor a small business. So you can't treat it like a small business, right? A small business is a great business, but it's got a regular trajectory. Startups are binary, right? They either succeed fast or fail fast. It might take many years to get to that point, but it's at that. Second, they're not enterprises. They're not actually even businesses. They are experiments. They are literally, you're testing something out till you find a repeatable and scalable business model. Steve Blank has a quote about that, with lean startups. But basically, until it's a business, it's just a startup, right? It's you're running these experiments, and that's a really good thing, right? That's something that corporations can learn from. They're like, okay, let's not judge this as a failure or success. It's neither, right? Let's validate that our assumptions are correct or not correct. Let's actually try to not invalidate them and then move on.
Yeah.
Couple of areas where the mindset doesn't necessarily work is startups are inherently risky, right? You've all heard the stats, 99% plus fail. And what's interesting is if you look at Series A funded, B funded, C funded, D funded, the numbers don't get that much better, right? Like, you might be talking about a 70% failure rate at Series D, and like, whoa, you hear all this news about the success, but they're pretty much, destined to fail, yet founders still choose to do them. So you have to understand that startup founders are not rational people, right? Like they choose to do it despite the odds. They believe they're going to be that one, or there's some calling that's so much greater than the odds. So that may or may not help a corporation. And I'll explain where it does help, because that was one of my talks that I gave a lot at Citibank. Where it doesn't align with a corporation is because of these odds, and because it's such a resource constrained process. Survival is key in the mindset of founder, right? I call this the decision tree of death. Every decision you make as a founder is option A, or your company fails. And not every decision that, but majority of decisions are that, but every decision feels like that. And startup founders make 15 of those decisions before breakfast every morning. Where at a corporation, executive can actually have the luxury to say, my job is to make 3 decisions every day, and I'm the best at making those 3 decisions. Founders don't have that luxury. So I think, when working with founders, you need to understand that when you're trying to work like founders, you can actually have the best of, the resources and security and safety with a mindset of both abundance and constraint, but really strong focus on metrics and KPIs to know when a hypothesis is validated or invalidated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where this survival mindset actually comes in really well, and this was important in the city example, but also I think anyone in an innovation group, is the greatest founders have usually two attributes. One is they're amazing problem solvers, and they're amazing storytellers. They can go out and pitch a vision to raise money, hire people, get customers, and they can build stuff, right? So I think, at Citibank, amongst the EIRs, when we would do these innovation, multi-day sessions, or I would coach certain founders, my area of expertise, and we would rotate, but it was always how to pitch. And some of the elements there are about connecting on an emotional level. I call it entertaining with evidence. You're not just telling a great story, you're also backing it up. But definitely go for the emotional before you go for the logical.
Mm-hmm.
There's something a lot of founders who've raised money understand is when you're raising money from a venture capitalist who inherently is in the job of identifying risk. If you give them if you go for the logical part of their brain and say, hey, this is why this is going to work, by nature, they're going to poke holes in your logic. Where if you connect with them on an emotional level and say, this is why it's important, and this actually holds true for digital transformation as well, it's just human nature. The mindset switches from punching holes to filling gaps. And once you make that connection, and this is also know to how. And I think that storytelling and the why behind innovation or digital transformation, if you're that person that's not at a C level and you're trying to get that champion to support you, I think that storytelling and problem solving side of what founders know by nature, I think is very important learning for executives at companies.
I love that analogy. We always talk about the fact that, decisions are usually made emotionally and then rationalized logically. And I love what you're describing, which is, and also we talk about the most important emotions in, for example, a customer journey, and how one of them is fear. And we don't usually create fear in our customers the way we might create other things like confusion or frustration. But they come with fear, because anytime we're asking someone to make a commitment, even if it's just pay $50, there's fear.
Yeah.
Oh, will I get screwed? Is this a mistake? Will this be a hassle? And so, to the degree that you can create in them an emotional feeling that this will be great, then you get that rational part of the mind. I love what you said. Instead of harnessing it to figure out why the answer should be no, you're harnessing that same rational part of the brain to figure out why the answer should be yes.
Exactly.
And I think that's genius. I love that. Yeah. This is fantastic. Well, this is great. And I could ask you a million more questions about this, but bearing the time, I really want to get to what we knew we were just going to be the cherry on the top of our conversation today, which is what's in the top secret briefings that Google has you give to their best clients. And can you give us at least a sampler platter of some of the key insights that you're sharing from Google about how companies can most effectively operate in this changing dynamic landscape, work from home, future of work, all of that?
Yeah. So, there is no secret sauce here.
Oh.
And as I mentioned it, there is
some secret thing.
There is a secret sauce, but it's a secret we've all known our whole lives. And it took a pandemic to really make it clear is, be human. We're all in this together. We're all humans. Yes, the technology allows us to communicate even when we can't be together in person, but it's still a substitute for interpersonal relationships. So, and it's lossy, right? Like, I would love to see you, right? I'd love to hug you. I'd love to obviously we're still friends, but have a beer. It's different. Cheers, and be okay if some of the liquid mixes, like it was supposed to be. But that just doesn't exist, right? And everyone is struggling: manager, employee, executive, gig worker, and we're in our heads, and you're not getting any physical cues or feedback. So we have to take that extra step to really be there for each other. So let me take a step back and kind of talk through what our point of view is on, the immediate response to the pandemic, the shift to home, shift to working from home, how to be successful working from home, and then reimagining the future, which I do believe will be some sort of hybrid situation. Yeah. And we have to solve for that, making sure it's equitable and everybody has access. And it's not about being as good as it was before. It's about being better. It's literally, what, I don't know if you've ever been to Google offices, but what Google did in the late 90s for physical office space, we now have that opportunity to redo that for the next 50 years. Generations of people working about what work can mean. And that's really powerful stuff. So before I jump to that opportunity or responsibility, Let me start with the simple stuff. First, this is completely like unprecedented, right? Nobody in the world has the answer. It hit us. We didn't, maybe we knew it was coming, but not like this, right? And the amazing thing is, several companies struggled in their transition to home, but they made it work, right? And all of a sudden they realized like maybe it's still duct taped together and VPNs aren't that great. And there's other things that Google has done that companies look to and say, hey, how can we do that? But most of those things we put in place years ago because of how we think and why we do things the way we do. Less so how we do them or what we do them, but why we do them. And that enabled us to, fortunately, have a relatively seamless transition home. But with that said, even legacy companies that are several hundred years old, made it work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Many people got burnt out. I know this to be true for some public sector agencies but you look at NASA, for example. Look how many rockets launched in this pandemic, right? They still made it work. It's not. Even if you can try to imagine like the TV stereotype of the most bureaucratic IT department, they still figured it out. It might not be smooth, but they figured it out. So the nice thing is it opened up our eyes. Okay, like this is an opportunity to do this right. Now the concern is, you may have also fed this to me at some point. Several people are probably going to waste this opportunity. Meaning we'll go back to the way things were, and it is what it is. But several folks will use this opportunity for digital transformation the right way, and see it as a way to make things more collaborative, productive, faster, all these things. So there's a few things, that we share with the executives. And like I said, it's not going to sound like any sort of secret sauce. It's all about being human. And top priority has always been the well-being of our employees, our people. And in the beginning, that meant getting everyone home, safe, secure, equipped, connected. And then during the transition to work from home, healthy, happy, productive. And those are very tall orders, right? It's, for a company to actually solve that for people. But that comes with checking in with people, training your managers, recognizing that, even if someone's saying everything's fine, it's probably not, mental health awareness, and just doing the best we possibly can to maintain the culture and being there for your people. Now that's not solved by any means. Now let's move a little bit more over to like productivity. This is another key takeaway. Activity does not equal productivity, right? Activity is a part of it, but so is well-being. If you see your developers are putting in more code at breakfast or lunch, or they're working longer days, that's not telling you how they're doing, right? And because this is so unprecedented, Google has had, decades of research on productivity and employee happiness that, we have these longitudinal studies that we can refer to, but also this is also a bit of an anomaly in time, right? So we have to be careful in making any conclusions, but employee well-being is, of the highest importance. Now I'll move forward a little bit into, how do you enhance that productivity using the tools that we have now.
Can I just make a connection though between two things you said? But This is fascinating, and I think what you said about startup founders making 15 critical decisions before breakfast. I think you could argue that in this day and age, many types of employees are making maybe not life or death decisions, but a lot of what you're paying your employees for are not just the hours they put in, but the decisions and the choices that they make.
Yeah.
Whether it's how to program a function within a application or whatever it is. And so that issue of well-being. We talk about productivity in terms of outcome, because clearly that's what a startup founder is measured on, right? Not how many hours he worked, but whether he got to that magical line where he could survive and ultimately, grow the company. So I want to just connect that idea that you're talking about well-being with this idea that when you're in a great state, when you're feeling good, when you're feeling happy, healthy, that's when you're more likely to make those great decisions. And when it's the opposite, then you're probably going to make poor decisions no matter how many hours you put in.
Yeah. And, that's a phenomenal point. And it does tie how this then enables us to be much stronger in our next iteration. And when I say ours, I don't mean Google, I mean everyone. And this is where I think the importance of the CIO, which is the area I'm focusing on right now, Chief Information Officer, which means different things at every company. Their role is now front and center, obviously because our technology is how we communicate and how the culture is transmitted. but it's also a time for that executive to lead. This is not the CFO, the CTO, even the HRO, or whoever the chief human resources person, and maybe not even the CEO. Obviously, the CEO has to set the vision and keep everyone aligned, but it could be the digital transformation, the information, the innovation folks that can step up now. First of all, the spotlight's on them. So this is their time to shine as the opportunity side, but responsibility, their time to lead. Second, it's an opportunity to put things in place that will have long-term benefits. And I really believe that's not a what or a how question. Yeah, you can put automation, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, virtual desktop, zero trust networking, all these things that will make you better for the next pandemic or the next crisis. But I don't think it's about that next crisis. It's about making crisis, managing crisis and operating through crisis part of your norm. And this gets to being a resilient organization where, the pandemic is a once in 100-year thing, but, being able to respond to these crises, this doesn't mean like panic and hair on fire all the time, but having an organization that's not, there might be minor hiccups here or there, but kind of like how things worked when we went home, weren't the smoothest. Next time, or in a different, more likely unexpected case, your business is continuing operations without skipping a beat. Yeah. And you can focus on things like employee well-being and making sure they're fine for whatever the situation is. So for example, even in this pandemic, it's not a cookie cutter situation that everyone's going through. Some people unfortunately lost loved ones. Some people got sick. Whether you have small children at home or you live with 5 roommates, work from home is not the ideal situation. However, if you're a software engineer and your kids are already adults or self-sufficient or out of the house, or you don't have kids, it might be phenomenal to work from home, right? So there's no one answer for everyone. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Great. Well, I know we're just about at the end of our time. Is there any other final thought, any other kind of tip, or Google did something that you'd say everyone should know about and should do that? Or we got some key ideas here, right? The humanity, looking out for people's well-being as much as anything else. Clearly the whole shift to the cloud, you talked about how quickly, and I've observed this too, the vast majority of companies were able to make the shift much more rapidly and with much less problem than they anticipated, notwithstanding some people who no doubt worked a lot of long nights and weekends. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the cloud, because people already had obviously a tool like Zoom, clearly cloud-based and scalable because of the cloud. And then, thank God our files were not stored, on our desktop computers back at the office kind of thing, So many of us had all of our stuff in the cloud, and we were already accustomed to that. So, the companies that had invested in that generally had an even easier time of it. And those that didn't were usually rushing to try to push that as quickly as possible, because of course that's what's needed for that kind of location independence. So anyway, you've already given us so much. I feel like I'm greedy, but before we close, any final cherry on top in terms of?
It'll be a real cherry. I'll give you 2 things: one from a corporate standpoint, and one from a startup standpoint. And I want to end this on not that our conversation was negative, but on a positive, forward-looking point of view, which is opportunity. And this pandemic was horrible, is horrible, and we'll get through it. And I wish it had never happened. Of course. But we know certain things to be very true right now. One is, it's times like these where the best innovations come out, right? Google came out of a time like this. Facebook came out of a time like this. Uber came out of a time like this. Those next companies are being built right now. Yeah. So, whether you're on the corporate side, working with startups or building something new, or you're a startup founder, you're building that next big thing, and it's happening right now. So we know it. And as much as, people might be pulling out or back, this is time to invest. On the corporate side, it's getting back to this concept of this opportunity to reimagine the future, right? So you brought up video conferencing. There's a couple of things that we can build in as first principles for these products, like equity and access for everyone. Video conferencing, whether it was built this way or other new upstarts kind of copied it, was really designed for conference room to conference room communication. And it's great for that. And occasionally, if you were home, you could log in, but you didn't know what the looks people were giving each other, or your audio would be messed up. Now it's kind of okay.
Man out. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we solve for a video conferencing platform where you have a recurring meeting, 3 people are in the office, 2 people aren't, and these are requirements that just, I don't want to say they didn't exist before, but they weren't the primary use case.
You're right.
And I think it just opens up, and you're seeing this, I'll use Google as an example, just with the rate of innovation in our Google Meet, our video product, from noise cancellation to, using certain elements of AI to blend the screen and record. It's just, the pace of that was so fast. That might have been in the roadmap.
Yeah.
But what happened in 2020 was a catalyst, and I think you're going to see it coming from all over the world now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we see is it comes from 2 angles. It comes from the side you just were talking about, which is the technology. And then it comes from a skill angle. The ability to lead a meeting well via this type of technology is similar in some ways to leading a great meeting in person. And by the way, a lot of meetings in person were led horribly for a long time. I know you want to say, and on a positive note, but obviously there's people who do it well and do it poorly. But doing it virtually is 60% different, 40% the same, but 60% different. Yeah. And so gaining those skills, I put out a blog post called "We All Need to Start Thinking Like Teenage Girls," and all I was talking about in it was camera angles, lighting. I mean, teenage girls who use Instagram all day long, they know where to put the camera. Exactly. They know how to find the light, Yeah. It's almost intuitive to them. But so many of us, older people in business, we never had to think before about where's the light, when I'm in a meeting. We never thought about that in an in-person meeting. Where's the light coming from,
Yeah.
And now you need to think like that. And so there's just this set of skills to be able to be a good leader or a good participant through these types of technologies. And just like we all had to learn how to use email, and it wasn't just about learning where the send button was, and not to use all caps, but like what works in email, what doesn't work in email, what should you really pick up the phone and talk to someone about, all these types of skills, the nuances of using email as a communication platform all those years ago. I feel like we're still a little bit nascent in terms of this. So as the platforms evolve, I'm also enthusiastic to see how all of our skills continue to evolve. And hopefully those 2 things are evolving together. And for example, take something like breakout rooms, most of the platforms are continuing to augment the way breakout rooms work. And as people who are leading meetings get more practiced and realize all the potential of saying, hey, I've got 20 people, then I'm going to break them into teams and I'm going to put them back together. Then it becomes, I can't move someone between breakout groups once the breakout starts. That's not, And so seeing that the use combined with the technology and how they grow together, I think that we have the potential to make these platforms even more powerful, to make even better and better experiences, interactions through video conferencing or whatever we're going to call it in the future.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And, following the lead of teenagers is probably a trend we could have,
in many ways.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Well, on that note, Tej, thank you so much for joining us. This has been amazing. I learned so much. I always do, just listening to you talk, but this is awesome. I'm really pleased we're able to open that up to all of our listeners and viewers. And thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody. Thanks. See you next time.